don't know, Symposium Club is a student-led club here on campus that tries to uphold the mind part of our school's mission to promote a mind and heart education. We like to promote intellectual discourse even outside the classroom. We do this by providing a platform for students to share their research, share their passions in life in an academic setting. So you are here tonight promoting that intellectual discourse, even if you didn't know it. And I'm here to introduce our speaker, but before I do, a shameless plug for our final symposium lecture on April 22nd. Come back and hear something else, educational and fun. All right. It is my honor to introduce our speaker tonight, who has both the brains and polish to make the presentation worthwhile. Wait, we didn't make a joke yet. All right. Alex Hoffman, or as he's known to some, Dr. Mr. President, sir, is a junior biology major with minors in both chemistry and speech communication. He is a two-time national champion in both speech and debate. Last summer, he got to work for the Department of Defense at the Armed Forces Radiobiology Research Institute in Bethesda, Maryland. This summer, he will be conducting research with Dr. Aaron Putsky at Whitworth using CRISPR technology to perform site-specific genome engineering of zebrafish. Some of his personal interests include human immunology and the evolution of HIV/AIDS. In fact, he wrote a review article entitled "Evolution at Work in HIV. Selection favors drug resistance due to disparities in antiretroviral therapy availability," which was being submitted to the Colorado Journal of Undergraduate Research. His future plans are to enter medical school and become a physician before of course, he runs for president. Please give a warm round of applause for Alex Hoffman.
Thank you, Sarah, for that introduction. I appreciate that. Thank you to the Symposium Board for allowing me to be the first dedicated science student. I know my colleague Rebecca has been up here before talking about climate change, but this is the first one dedicated specifically to science. And then thank you to the students. I know especially it's midterms week. I know it's crazy. Thank you for being here. And to the wider audience, this shows me that this topic is not just interesting to me, but hopefully of interest to you enough that you actually came out tonight. So, of course, we're talking about intelligent design and evolution tonight, but before we get into the real nitty-gritty science, I want to start with a story. This, as Sarah said, I did research last summer with the Department of Defense, and this was the man that I was paired with. His name is Dr. Amit Verma. He's a postdoctoral fellow originally from India, and over the course of the summer, he's a cancer biologist. We got very close, and one day I asked him, we were just having a conversation, I asked him, Amit, in India, is there such a controversy over the theory of evolution? Is there a controversy over the teaching of the theory of evolution? And Amit was flabbergasted when I told him that not very many Americans actually accept evolution. And this is what I call the paradox of science in the United States. That the United States is the best in the world at teaching science. We have the best institutions in the world, undergraduate, graduate, postdoctoral fellowships, you name it. People from all around the world want to come here because we are the epitome of science, and yet our own people don't accept some fundamental theories like the theory of evolution. This was a Pew poll taken 2 years ago. The United States is down here at 19 out of 20 developed countries that were polled, and this specific poll asked, humans evolved from common ancestors, true or false? And we got about a 40% true rating, about 40% false, and 20% not sure. But you can see, compared to other countries, we are really far behind, especially when you look at the institutions and the availability of the educational resources that we have at our disposal. So I hope this serves as a springing point for why we're talking about this today, because with all of the access that we have, why are we trailing behind in acceptance of something so fundamental as the theory of evolution by natural selection? And I contend it's two main reasons. One, it's just a fundamental misunderstanding of what evolution actually is. But secondly, it's the growing popularity of things like intelligent design in this country. So we're going to talk about both of those today. But first, I'll give you a roadmap of where we're going. We're going to talk first about why evolution matters in the first place. Then we're going to go into what evolution actually is, make sure that we're on the same page. Because oftentimes in an evolution debate, we're not talking about the same things. We're just going in different directions. We're going to look at some common arguments against evolution before going into the meat of the argument, which is intelligent design. We're going to look at some of the inherent flaws of intelligent design and end by looking at what evolution looks like in your classroom. And hopefully by the end, you'll see that evolution is a well-supported, well-documented scientific theory, and something like intelligent design simply doesn't hold water in comparison. So with that, let's start with why evolution matters in the first place. And evolution matters really to two specific groups of people for different reasons. The first group of people are scientists like me, or people who are trying to become scientists, people who use the theory in everyday practice. And that's why this quote is so important. This is Theodosius Dobzhansky. He was a geneticist and evolutionary biologist in the 1970s and 80s. And he says that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And what he's getting at is that prior to Darwin's publication in 1859 of Origin of Species, you had all different types of biology going on. You had early embryologists who were beginning to use their microscopes to look at how organisms develop and seeing some similarities there. You had paleobiologists looking at the fossil record, seeing that organisms in the past don't look like the organisms that we have today. You have anatomists who were beginning to look at comparative anatomy, especially when specimens began arriving from the New World to the Old World. They looked similar, but not exactly the same. So we were having these questions, but without the unifying theme of evolutionary biology. Those are all separate. They're not connected. And evolutionary biology as a tool for modern science is extremely powerful. But of course, all of you aren't science majors, so why does it matter to you? The answer here is actually pretty simple, and the answer is because it's our history. It's true. It's the reason why we're all sitting here. We have common ancestors that go back hundreds of millions, if not billions of years, and it's natural history, but it's our history. So that's why evolution matters to everyone in this room, regardless of if you're a scientist or not. Next, let's talk about what evolution actually is to make sure that we're all on the same page going forward. Evolution is pretty simple, but it's often misunderstood because people get away from what evolution actually is. But this is pretty much in a flow diagram how evolution works. So variation exists among individuals in a population. These are characteristics, eye color, hair color, height, the way that you develop in the womb, all the way down to really tiny biochemical processes at the cellular or even microscopic level. So those are variations that we have, and ultimately we know now this comes from mutation. Secondly, variable character traits are passed down between generations, and at the time Darwin didn't know that this was because of DNA and genes, but we knew that if I have offspring, they're more likely to be like me than your offspring are to mine. So they're going to look like me, at least somewhat. These character traits provide some individuals with benefits that are unique to their environment, and because resources are limited, not everyone is going to survive, and that's going to lead to competition. If there's competition, if you have any advantage, you are more likely to survive and reproduce, and thus your character traits are going to be passed down to your offspring and become more common in that population. And number 5 is basically evolution defined. That evolution is the change in gene frequencies in a population, not individuals. Individuals will never evolve. I will never be anything but Homo sapien, neither will you. But a population can change over time. And those gene frequencies is how it happens. Notice here, evolution doesn't talk about the origin of the universe. This doesn't say Big Bang. This doesn't say creation. It doesn't even talk about the origin of life. That's a totally different scientific theory. And Darwin published a book called The Origin of Species for a reason, not the origin of life. He was talking about how species diversify, not where they came from in the first place. Although we can talk about abiogenesis later. Natural selection is Charles Darwin's contribution to evolution. He provided the mechanism by which evolution can occur naturally. And this is from an experiment by a guy named Kettlewell. And these are moths that are found all over. And you can see very clearly, if you were a bird on this right-hand side, which one are you going to go after? Probably the one that's white, that pretty much sticks out. Or here, you probably can't even see the white one because it blends in so well. So this is natural selection. The environment selects those individuals best fit for that particular environment at that particular time, and thus they're going to be able to better survive and reproduce and pass on their genes to their offspring. And that is Darwin's contribution as far as natural selection. So hopefully we're on the same page now. Let's run through some of the lines of evidence for evolution. And there is quite a bit, but let's start with one of the most fundamental, which is the fossil record. The fossil record is contentious, and I really don't know why. I guess perhaps because there are some gaps, and of course, the fossil record is always going to have gaps. Really, the fossil record is a gift to us. Fossilization is a rare event. But that being said, fossilization events that we have discovered show very clearly evolutionary change over time. So I want to show specifically some transitional forms because these show a clear transition from different forms of life that show that we are all ancestors of something more distant. So this is a fossil called Tiktaalik. It was discovered in Canada and was dated to approximately 375 million years. And obviously it looks kind of like a fish and kind of like an amphibian, and that's exactly what we wanted to find in this specific time zone in the rock. We had rocks and fossils that were dated before this that were fish-like, and after this that were amphibian-like. And so we would expect to find some sort of transitional form in between, and that's exactly what we find in Tiktaalik. You see the eyes on the top of the head, which is not characteristic of fish, and fish don't have this wide flat head like this, they have a flat head like that. But you still have retaining characteristics of a fish, these fins here. If you go farther back, it retains its back fins, and you have scales like a fish. But you have this digitization of the fins here, meaning bones are growing into it, and you have a rotation of what's called the shoulder girdle underneath, so it can drag itself on the ground, which fish don't have, and mammals are very well developed for walking on the ground like that. And Tiktaalik is just one of many different transitional forms that we have in the same time period, but transitioning in different phases, we have lots of evidence there. Another transitional form that's interesting, this is called Archaeopteryx, and this one was dated to 150 million years ago. This is a transitional form between dinosaurs and birds, or modern aves. And what you can see here again are characteristics of both classes of organisms. If you look really closely here, you're going to see feathers, which of course we wouldn't associate with dinosaurs. But we see a beak up here, which is something we wouldn't associate with dinosaurs either. But in that beak, you have teeth, which is something we wouldn't associate with birds. It has 4 arms, which have claws, which we know that birds don't retain their claws, they just have feathery wings. And so we are seeing differences that show that it's sort of like a bird and sort of like a reptile, and an artist's rendition shows pretty clearly it looks kind of like a dinosaur, but kind of like a bird as well. So these transitional forms highlight our evolutionary history pretty well. Human evolution is also contentious. There have been numerous books written on this saying that the human fossil record is incomplete. But that really goes against the evidence once again. They also like to say that the fossils are not complete in and of themselves. These are 3 of the best specimens. Of course, they're not going to be perfect. But this shows a transition from more ancient humans, Australopithecus afarensis, better known in the media as Lucy, and Neanderthalensis. If you are not of African origin in this room, between 1% and 3% of your DNA is actually the same as Neanderthals because we interbred in Western Europe a couple 100,000 years ago. And Homo erectus, one of our closest cousins again. So these are all well documented in the fossil record. But another line of evidence is molecular homology, which is something that Charles Darwin never had any access to. He didn't know how DNA worked or how genes worked. And what's so beautiful is that all of the molecular evidence reinforces what we already knew through the fossil record. So in this picture, what you can see here on the left, in the brown, this is evidence that came from the fossil record. And what I love about the fossil record, again, is that it's 3-dimensional. You have time here, you have geographic location, and then these different species are based on anatomical differences. So it's really 3-dimensional. So this was constructed based off of the fossil record, and on the right, we sequenced the genes of the same species. And when you sequence the genes and look how similar or dissimilar the genes are, you find that you create an identical tree based on different evidence. Basically, just looking at the genes or looking at the fossils and where they're found, you create the exact same tree based on the molecular data. And this is the same for just about any gene that you can look at across any living species. This was one that I ran a quick search, phylogeny, which is family tree, bacteria, and this is a gene that codes for arsenic-reducing capabilities of bacteria. And when you sequence it, you construct a beautiful family tree that clearly shows common ancestry that all of these organisms share. It's again saying when you look at humans, this one is a really elegant one. I really like this one. In early molecular days, one of the first things that we were able to do was what's called a karyotype, which is looking at the actual chromosomes of an organism under the microscope. And when we did that, there was a problem. Evolution says we are related to great apes like orangutans and chimpanzees. But when we looked at their karyotype, humans were missing 2 chromosomes. So if that's the case, that doesn't really show much evidence in support of evolution. But when we actually sequence the chromosomes, we found that human chromosome 2 is an exact match between chimpanzee chromosome 12 and 13, as if they fused together. In fact, these regions in yellow are called telomere regions, which are usually only found at the caps of chromosomes. But because these two fused, we found telomere regions in the middle and a secondary centromere region, which are only found in the center. So two centromeres and telomeres in the middle, the exact same genes show us that sometime in our evolutionary history, chimpanzees and humans, the chimp genes or chromosomes fused. Just another example of molecular evidence towards evolution. And the final example I'll give is anatomical homology. Homology is something you've probably heard of in ninth grade biology, homologous structures. For example, the bones in my hand are the same bones in a whale's fin as a bat's wing because we all share common ancestors. But I want to give one that I think really shows how evolution is not always the most efficient designer, but it gets the job done. So obviously this is a giraffe, and here you have the central nervous system, the brain, and the recurrent laryngeal nerve. This is a branch of the vagus nerve. This nerve comes out of the brain, comes down, wraps around the aortic arch, and comes back up and innervates the larynx, which is the voice box, so that the giraffe can make sounds. Interestingly, it leaves and innervates, comes down 7 or 8 feet, back 7 or 8 feet, and ends up just a few inches away from where it started. Not the most efficient design. But if we take evolution to be true, we would see that perhaps fish and mammals like giraffes or ourselves perhaps share common ancestry, and we can look to their anatomy to give us an answer to this question. So, when we do look at the anatomy of fish, what we find is that fish have the same 4 branches of their vagal nerve, and they have 6 aortic arches. We've only retained 3 because our hearts are a little more efficient. But they loop around in the exact same fashion, but they loop in a dorsal to ventral manner, whereas in evolutionary history, humans produced a head and a neck, and our heart dropped into the thoracic cavity. And we retained the same loop, but it now has to travel a lot farther distance, going down and back up, just as a result of our evolutionary history and our shared ancestry with something like a fish. Another elegant example of how evolutionary history seems to be borne out in the evidence. So now we've looked at what evolution is, and before we go any further and talk about intelligent design, I really want to ensure that some of the more common arguments are discounted before moving on what I think is a more dangerous argument of intelligent design, because most of these are pretty easily discounted, and we'll go through them one by one. The first is that evolution is quote-unquote only a theory, or just a theory, as if that means that it's a weak theory. The problem is theory in a scientific sense means something totally different than in a colloquial sense. If I say I have a theory as to who stole the cookies from the cookie jar, that means something different than how scientists mean it. A theory from a scientific perspective is a well-supported, well-documented, well-evidenced body of information that support one reading of the evidence. So in our case for evolution, this is evidence that supports change over time, natural selection. And what's really transparent about this argument is that it's obviously not a scientific argument, because the same person who tells you, oh, I don't believe in evolution, it's only a theory, doesn't say that about any of these theories. And it's because they don't have a problem with the conclusions of these theories. People don't mind that germ theory says that bacteria and viruses cause disease. They don't have a problem with the idea that cells make up all of our bodies, or that atoms are made of protons, neutrons, and electrons. They don't have problems with that. It's rather that they have a problem with the conclusion of evolution, and so they attack it by saying it's just a theory. So obviously, that doesn't hold any water. The second one is that evolution is a random process. And I understand from an outside perspective how evolution seems random. This picture comes from the Discovery Institute in Seattle, and it's an intelligent design think tank. And what it is supposed to highlight is evolution is random, i.e., it's like a tornado ripping through a scrapyard and assembling at random a Boeing 747. And I freely admit, if that's how evolution worked, that would be pretty improbable. But of course, this is a straw man. This isn't exactly how evolution works. Evolution, in fact, natural selection, the mechanism by which evolution works, is the antithesis of randomness. If you have certain conditions, variation, if you have competition, if you have variation that can be passed between generations, evolution is going to occur. The only thing random about evolution is mutations, and the only thing random about mutations is that we can't predict where and when they're going to be. But that being said, some enzymes are notoriously more error-prone than others. A good example is reverse transcriptase in HIV. One of the reasons why it's so hard to treat is because it's highly mutation-prone. But DNA polymerase in our bodies is not. So there's differences between mutation rates, and we can actually quantify them. And so evolution, yes, has a random element, but it is not a random process. It's actually the opposite of random. Finally, don't read any of the words here. It's going to illustrate a point. But the difference between micro and macroevolution. A lot of people say, you know, I can accept microevolution. For example, I can accept that bacteria can evolve antibiotic resistance over the course of 20 or 30 years. But I don't think that that is something that I can see producing big changes in species, going from A to Z. Of course, this, once again, is a misunderstanding of evolution. Evolutionists never say that an organism goes from A to Z in one step overnight. Microevolution, rather, occurs over hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of iterations over thousands and millions of years, such that microevolutionary changes can have a cumulative effect, thus producing macro changes. So what this is supposed to get at is that from here to here, we have a macro change from red to blue, but it occurs in many, many, many small steps, to the point that I couldn't tell you, and you probably couldn't tell me, where the last red letter is and where the first blue one starts. But we certainly can agree from start to finish we have a macroevolutionary change in color. So that's the fallacy behind that argument. At this point, we can now transition to intelligent design, because hopefully we now have a good enough understanding of what evolution is, because in many ways intelligent design takes what evolution has started and tries to poke holes in it. So with that, let's look at intelligent design in detail. It was really first applied to biology with William Paley. He is a theologian. In 1802, he published a book called Natural Theology. And in Natural Theology, Paley used the watch as an example of design. His basic argument was, if you came across this stopwatch, and he used the stopwatch because it was the most technologically advanced thing at the time. If you found a stopwatch in the middle of a field and picked it up, you would see all of these intricate cogs and gears and springs all working together for a specific function. It seems to have a purpose, that is, to tell time. You wouldn't think that just randomly happened, that it just happened to be there out of natural forces. Rather, you would think that there's some sort of intelligence behind it. Two notes here, just an interesting side fact. William Paley, Darwin notes as being the most influential person on his works. In fact, with the Bible, natural theology, and a few books on anatomy, those were the only books that Darwin took with him on the HMS Beagle. I think it just goes against the fact that Darwin is this godless heathen. But the second main note is that Paley didn't apply this argument to organ systems, or of course he didn't know biochemical systems, but he applied this to an entire species, saying that humans have a different function and purpose in life and place in the world that's different from orangutans, that's different from giraffes, that's different from jellyfish. He looked at it from a much more broad sense. And Paley's argument really lent itself to Younger's creationism, which was the dominant form of intelligent design at the time. And it's intelligent design in that there's an intelligent force behind the creation of life. Younger's creationism has really fallen out of favor. It really flies in the face of almost any scientific discipline, and I'm not going to give much weight to it tonight, because the more, I believe, the more dangerous view towards a scientific belief is actually modern intelligent design, which we'll talk about in more detail. But modern intelligent design is really the same argument that Paley set forth in natural theology, but different language. Intelligent design proponents have gotten really smart. They use scientific language, they use scientific arguments to poke holes in evolution and say that it's scientific in nature. Thus, that's how they try to get it into the classroom. So the big names here are Michael Behe, a PhD biochemist at Lehigh University, and Stephen Meyer, incidentally, was a philosophy professor here at Whitworth University in the past. He now heads the Discovery Institute in Seattle. Like I said, same argument, new language, and their big argument today is called irreducible complexity, and we'll look at that. However, from a theological perspective, it comes to a God and gas argument, and I'm not going to talk much about that, but that's not a good theological position to hold if you want to maintain a theistic worldview. And then ask yourself, as we move towards looking what intelligent design is, ask yourself the questions: is it a unified theory, and does it have explanatory or predictive power? And then weigh that with evolution as we move forward. And the answer will be very clear here. So the first thing I want to do here is give you a video on what irreducible complexity is. This is the battle cry of the modern intelligent design movement. It's coined by Michael Behe, this guy right here, professor of biochemistry at Lehigh University. And the basic argument is that, and he defines it in his book, Darwin's Black Box, a single system which is composed of several interacting parts that contribute to the basic function where the removal of any one of the parts causes the system to effectively cease functioning. Basically, some systems are so complex, if you take one thing out, it doesn't work, therefore evolution could have never produced it. It would have had to be there all at once. And Behe focuses mainly on the bacterial flagellum, which this video will talk about, the vertebrate immune system, how we fight off disease, and the clotting system of our bodies if we're injured. So we're going to look here at specifically irreducible complexity as applied to the bacterial flagellum.
Under the microscope, bacteria powered by flagella seem almost acrobatic. They tumble, corkscrew, and pirouette, thanks to that whip-like filament. Driving this propeller is a tiny motor, part of a complex structure made of about 40 different kinds of proteins.
The bacterial flagellum looks like a sort of Jules Verne notion of what the future looks like. It has a strange sort of mechanical quality to it, these sort of cogs and waving tails and stuff.
And according to Behe, if any one of these parts is missing from the system, the motor can't function. Behe calls systems like this irreducibly complex, a term he coined. And he argues such systems could not have evolved naturally.
The idea is that there are certain aspects of life, perhaps organisms or organs or even cells, that in a sense could only have come about as a whole. In other words, it's very unlikely they could have come about through just a kind of contingent combination of parts over even millions or billions of years, but rather in a sense had to be created whole cloth all together at once, because everything fits together so well that to remove one part, the thing wouldn't function.
Great. Okay, so irreducible complexity as applied to the bacterial flagellum, that's a good overview and it gives you a pictorial representation of the main argument. But there's two problems with irreducible complexity, and it's the same for the other examples that Behe gives in his book, but we're going to focus, since we looked at the video of the flagellum, why this is, one, not a good scientific answer, and two, why from a theological perspective it's problematic as well. So this comes from a review in the journal Nature. It's the most prestigious journal in all of science, Nature Reviews in Microbiology. On the left here is the bacterial flagellum, and all of these different color units, I would say, are different proteins. And each of them does have a role to play in the proper functioning of the bacterial flagellum. So yes, Michael Behe, if we took out this green one or these pink pillars and we're left with this is not going to function as a bacterial flagellum. However, the fallacy of the argument here is that that means that the system is then of no use to the organism. But what we see here in three different organisms, these are three different species of bacteria. One of them happens to be the one that caused the bubonic plague. These are systems called injectosomes or secretory systems. These are basically channels by which bacteria can produce toxins inside the cell and inject them into their host and cause disease and misery. So yes, without these proteins, you're not going to have a functional flagellum like this, but you can have a less complex system that has a perfectly good function that evolution and natural selection could act on, from which a more complex structure could evolve sequentially. So no, this is not an irreducibly complex structure. There's evidence as to how it could actually have arisen from a natural process. The second main point here from a theological perspective is the problem with this thinking is that the designer, which of course is pretty transparent, this is a God-type figure, a theistic-type figure, then is vulnerable to their gap where they fit in, always reducing in size. Because what got the gaps basically is saying, well, science hasn't filled in this piece of information. Therefore, I'm going to say that a designer or God fits into this gap. As science, though, fills in the gaps, as science did when it came to the secretory system and the flagellum, that gap gets smaller and smaller. And from a theistic perspective, where God can now reside in the natural order gets smaller and smaller. So on two counts, scientifically and theologically, this is not a really sound argument to make. and it's really the only argument that distinguishes modern intelligent biochemical systems. And largely for these reasons, this is why the scientific community has rejected it almost in its entirety. This is probably the best example of intelligent design from a scientific perspective. Darwin's black box, Michael Behe, like I said, biochemist. He understands the systems, he is a scientist, he knows the language, but the scientific community almost in entirety has rejected it. Lehigh University Department of Biology unanimously passed this resolution, unanimously except for Michael Behe, who is a professor in the department, saying to their prospective students that they don't accept intelligent design, they don't accept it as scientific, and basically it's their position that it's not going to be taught at their school. Then Ken Miller of Brown University, who's been to Whitworth University a few times in the past, very prolific science textbook author, he says that the sterile definition of design means that Behe is free to ignore any conceivable evidence for the evolution of any biochemical system, because Behe basically says that if it looks designed, it is designed. And that's something that you can't test, that's not something that you can falsify. And then Richard Dawkins, Oxford University, a really influential evolutionary biologist, sums it up really well in a metaphor by saying that Behe's error is akin to the belief that you cannot win cards unless you have a perfect hand. That you have to have all of those things functioning all together at once to win or to be successful. But as we've seen, you can take some of those parts away and still have a fully functional organelle and still quote-unquote win. You could be a perfectly good injectosome, you won't be a flagellum, but you can have utility to that organism. So at the end of this, as we've looked at both of the theories, as I asked you to look at those questions from the beginning, first, is there evidence for intelligent design? As you can see, the way that intelligent design works, it inherently cannot have evidence. It simply says, look at the lack of evidence where science is, and says, I'm going to inject a designer here because science hasn't figured out how it could occur naturally. So it's not an evidence-gathering field. It's simply saying, look at these holes. The second point is that, is it consistent? And consistency is really key here. Like I said, we're not going to focus on younger creationism as much. The problem is, if I came up to an intelligent design component X and an intelligent design component Y and asked them what they actually believe, one could basically tell me younger creationism. I believe in a God that provided, or a designer that provided the origin of life, and it has not changed over time. And the Earth is 6,000 years old, and they call themselves an intelligent design component. Or you can get someone like Michael Behe, who I do really respect, but for all intents and purposes, is an evolutionary biologist. He accepts macroevolution. The Earth is billions of years old. In only 3 systems does Behe say that there needs to be the injection of an intelligent designer. So for all intents and purposes, he's an evolutionist. So you get a wide spectrum here, and it's not consistent. Whereas you could go to any university across this country and ask a professor of biology what evolution means. You're going to get a consistent answer, because the evidence is very consistent. And it's not based on an ideology either. Now this, I didn't put this here to offend anyone, but I wanted to now transition into intelligent design into the classroom. And I'm not making a point that's anti-Christian here. I'm simply making the point that the reality of the political structure in the United States is such that if someone is trying to legislate intelligent design into the classroom, it's very transparent that those legislatures in the United States are not legislating Islamic intelligent design. They're not legislating that worldview into the classroom. They're not legislating a Jewish worldview or a Buddhist worldview. They're very clearly injecting a Christian worldview into the classroom. That's their goal by getting intelligent design into the classroom. So while we see that it's not scientific and inherently religious, there are still attempts to get intelligent design in the classroom. And if there's one thing we can take away here tonight, is hopefully go out and protect our schools, protect our kids from bad science and bad ideas, which intelligent design, I think, clearly is one of those. So there have been numerous court cases about this, and it shouldn't be that controversial that the jurisprudence is quite clear that teaching religion in a science classroom violates the First Amendment. And Pittsburgh v. Dover was the most recent court case which affirmed that when it comes to intelligent design. Judge John Jones III, appointed by George W. Bush, ironically, during the case, Bush came out in favor of intelligent design, But Judge Jones ruled against intelligent design in the classroom, but he went further than any other judge had gone in the past, because his decision said not only is it religious in nature, but it's not scientific, so it shouldn't be in the science classroom in the first place. So his decision, I think, serves as a really good point to wrap up this conclude this presentation, because it really wraps up all the arguments I've tried to make tonight. The first point that he makes in his decision is that it's very obvious this is a religious argument. You can call it an intelligent design, or you can call it what you want. It's clear that this is a theistic worldview trying to pass itself off as a scientific perspective. He goes further, though, and he says that it's not scientific because, one, it violates the ground rules of science that says that you can't imply supernatural causation for a natural phenomena. Now, that's not to say that it couldn't be true. I mean, it very well could be true. But that's not scientific because there's no way to test it. And that's really the gatekeeper for what science is or what science isn't. He talks about irreducible complexity and says basically that's not a logical view to hold. And third, he says, and in the trial, Michael Behe was the only expert witness for intelligent design from a scientific perspective, that all of the attacks that Behe has made, irreducible complexity, were refuted by the scientific community and their expert testimony at trial. And then the final point that he made really is a pragmatic point, that if you are going to pass it off as science, presumably if I was a science student in Bio 101 at Whitworth and I had to do a research paper on intelligent design, I better be able to go into the library and pull up some primary literature on intelligent design. But Behe testified under oath, and it remains the fact to this day, that in 2005, and again to this day, there's not a single peer-reviewed intelligent design manuscript published. It just hasn't been done. It's not been gaining the acceptance in the scientific community needed to be a scientific theory of any merit. So conclusions, I want to leave you with two quotes by two very influential scientists. The first, obviously, the man, Charles Darwin. It's advisable to perceive clearly our ignorance. So hopefully tonight, if you weren't sure what evolution was, or you weren't sure what intelligent design was, or either, hopefully some of that has been cleared up, and at the very least this serves as a jumping point for you to do some of your own research, to follow the evidence. And the second I want to throw in, because at a religious university there seems to be tension between the two, and there really doesn't have to be. Galileo Galilei, a great scientist as well, he says he doesn't feel obliged to believe that the same God who has endowed us with sense, reason, and intellect has intended us to forego their use. You have the capabilities in each one of you to look at the evidence and analyze it for yourself. And I think if you do that with your God-given reason, or however you think you have reason or rational abilities, the evidence speaks for itself, and intelligent design simply doesn't hold up against the theory of modern evolution by natural selection. And the fact of the matter is you can hold both views, and I think some of the best biologists and chemists and biochemists in the world who are Christians are just a few buildings over in Robinson Hall and Eric Johnston. So it can be done. It's not necessarily a conflict of interest here. And these are just some books at the popular level. If you're interested in reading some more, they're all at a level anyone could understand. You don't have to be a science genius. And I think with that, thank you all for your time, and I think we have time for questions.
As Alex mentioned, we'd like to open up for any questions, if you guys have any, from either his presentation or something extraneous like that. So please raise your hand, and I can bring you the mic.
I probably don't need the mic, if that's okay. So, I guess this is a little bit of a curveball, Alex, but I was reading the New York Times this morning, and they had a picture of people picketing Al Gore's climate change lectures. And they had a sign that said, "Science isn't done by consensus." So you made the argument that because there are no peer-reviewed articles, intelligent design isn't science. Do you think that's true, or do you think that that's true in all senses, or, I mean, can you explain why?
I think it's one contributing factor to why you can't include it as a scientific discipline. Science is not only a way of knowing or a way of finding out things, but it's a body of knowledge. And if there is no primary literature to base further research on, or even to start the research on, you can't have a scientific endeavor on that. So I understand what you're saying, because although I would say those people who are picketing are they don't understand the science either. So science is, in a way, about consensus, and that's how it works, but it's not the only thing that makes it unscientific. The fundamental thing that makes it unscientific, and it's not the only thing that makes something scientific, is that it's not testable or refutable. Because from an intelligent design perspective, I could say, I believe fairies caused the bacterial flagellum to be the way it is. You can't refute that, I can't test that, and so it's inherently not worth looking into it any further from a scientific perspective. So it's one of some factors that make it inherently non-scientific. Good question. Hello?
Come on, let me do it.
Sorry.
So earlier on in your lecture, you talked about not consistency, but you talked about common ancestry with your anatomical homology point, and you stated that chimpanzees and fish have similar structures to humans. Could that also be evidence of a common creator rather than a change through an evolutionary process?
At that point, again, you're getting into the I can't test that, but the problem is if you're going to look at everything, let's assume that we look at nature like it's an open book. Do you really think that the designer is giving us reason and intellect and a way to look at the evidence, and is going to make it look as if there is common ancestry? So is the question that there could be common ancestry and it's still intelligent designer driven, or just that the same designer designed them?
So with the similarities between the two, could that point to there being a designer who designed them both?
I guess there's no way for me to logically disprove that. So it could be. I think it's exceedingly improbable based on the amounts of evidence that we have and the processes that we know could actually bring about those changes. From multiple lines of evidence, the anatomical evidence, the molecular evidence, it's improbable, but not logically disprovable.
So I just had a question. A minute ago, you kind of said that it wasn't worth even thinking about from a scientific perspective. So simply because you can't find a scientific reason for it right now and you don't think it's true, does that mean there's no reason to further explore this?
I think what I was trying to get at is, if we're going to explore it scientifically, you have to have, it has to pass some, it's like a gatekeeper, like I said. So there are tons of things that could be considered non-scientific that are testable. But in order to be scientific, one of the first things it has to be is testable. So if I can't test it, I'm not going to proceed to try and test it when I know I can't. I can't refute it. It can't be falsified. So if we're looking specifically at irreducible complexity, there's no reason to pursue it from a scientific approach because there's no way to scientifically test it. Like I said, it could be true. It could be the way that it happened. But there's no reason for me as a scientist to base research on it when I can't actually get a result. Because if I can't falsify it, the result is meaningless. So I do think that there is value in learning about it because it's a really popular theory, and it's really, since 1802 and even before, the philosophical argument is just the teleological argument, the argument from design. And all Paley did was apply it to organisms. So it is a strong argument that warrants study, but you can't do it from a scientific perspective.
So Francis Collins, one of the leaders of the Human Genome Project and the director of the National Institute of Health, is a large proponent of God-guided evolution. Do you believe that there's an inherent danger in this, and for other scientific studies besides just evolution?
Francis Collins is a really smart guy. I'm not going to say that he's a bad scientist whatsoever. And like I said, you can have both. You don't have to necessarily put on your scientist hat and leave your religion hat at the door, or vice versa. I think Francis Collins, to the best of my knowledge, is not a young earth creationist. I believe he would not put himself in that category. And what he's getting at is theistic evolution, which is different in a few regards to intelligent design, basically saying that everything occurred naturally, but the guiding force behind it was some intelligence. Again, I can't disprove it, I'm not going to get into a religious debate, and I know me and Tyler are talking about this a lot, but again, it's not necessarily a bad idea, and obviously his work speaks for itself, so he's not a bad scientist at all. And of the two, intelligent design versus theistic evolution, intelligent design is much more dangerous because theistic evolution doesn't claim to be science. Theistic evolution simply says, I believe in everything that occurred naturally, but there was some higher plan behind it. I think that's totally different than saying this specific system was designed and it's evidence of a specific designer.
In debates about evolution and just science in general, there's a lot of confusion among theists and non-theists regarding the difference between methodological and philosophical naturalism. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. So the difference between the two, methodological naturalism, I could be a methodological naturalist and a philosophical naturalist, meaning that I believe the only thing in the universe is physical matter. And as a methodological naturalist, that would be perfectly fine. I could also be a methodological naturalist and a non-physicalist, that I could believe that there's something more than the physical, that there's a spiritual realm. Science operates under the assumption of methodological naturalism. Like I said, we have to assume that natural causes or natural phenomena have natural causes. And from a scientific perspective, it's really just science wouldn't work if we don't make that assumption. Because, like I said, if we allow for supernatural causation to come into the factor, again, it's not testable. And if it's not testable, again, it's not necessarily wrong. But if I can't test it, there's no way for you to disagree with my results or for me to present my results or persuade you with some sort of evidence because it's just me saying, I believe this supernatural agent caused it. Rather, if we have physical phenomena, we can study it and quantify it and produce results that everyone has access to, can critique, can do a repeat experiment. If they get the same results, that's great. If they don't, that calls into question the materials, the methods, etc. And so that's just the way science has to operate. That's a good question because you don't have to be a philosophic naturalist. You don't have to say that there's no such thing as heaven and hell and be an evolutionist. You can be of both persuasions. Okay, someone there.
I can speak out loud. The theory behind evolution, genetic change, is mutation. And mutation has to give some type of selected advantage. So whatever nature or competition can select for that. Has there been any studies outside of bacteria that have shown an induced mutation has actually given it a creature an advantage that it can propagate to its next species? Because in my reading, any mutation that they've done, it's actually been a sterile mutation or it's been something that has caused that particular organism to die sooner than the natural.
So a good example maybe is sickle cell anemia. Something that is not necessarily a good mutation to have, but if you have a point mutation in the hemoglobin gene, you actually can no longer get malaria. If you're homozygous recessive, meaning you have both of the bad alleles, you're going to die of sickle cell anemia, and this largely affects African populations. If you're a heterozygote, you have the capability of resisting malaria and surviving. So there's actually a benefit of having a deleterious mutation in the genome, even though the selective advantage isn't going to be good if you're a homozygote, but rather it would be an advantage to have the two pairs. So that's one example of a mutation that has a selective advantage if you're a carrier as a heterozygote. As far as induced mutations, as far as an experimenter inducing a mutation in their organism of interest and seeing if that's good, I'm not aware off the top of my head of any. However, I think you can look to studies like in the Amazon. As far as natural selection occurring, we've seen it in species other than bacteria. We've seen it in guppies, we've seen it in plants, we've seen it in bats, we've seen it in. But of course, this is a process that takes tens of thousands of years, so seeing it in action is difficult, and that's why bacteria are useful. And so I'm not sure on the top of my head if there has been an induced mutation to show positive effects or not. I would assume yes, but I can't give you a specific answer. Go ahead.
Alright,
So in the beginning, you mentioned the difference between origin of species and origin of the universe.
Yes.
Origin of species, obviously, just get all the data about, and I think the origin of the universe would have a stronger pull for more intelligent design and other different hypotheses.